Everyone to this Demos event where we are talking about epistemic security and the new fight to protect the information supply chains. This is a small boutique audience, but I've just had a chat with everyone who's come along, and I just want to say that the people in the audience are rivaling us in expertise. So in the room we've got Public Digital, we've got, well, not we've got the BBC, we've got charities, so we're keen to kind of bring the audience into the conversation as well, make it very conversational. So thank you everyone for coming, for backing the queue and for resisting the lure of the DSIT debate that's happening on the Online Safety Act at the same time. My name's Polly Curtis and I'm the Chief Executive of the cross-party think tank Demos. And our work is very focused on how to improve democracy and win back trust in the context of huge declines in public trust in democracy. And the information that feeds those democratic systems is absolutely critical, as I think we all here know, and undergoing rapid and challenging changes at the moment. So we set up this programme of work looking at epistemic security. It's a long phrase which Hannah's about to kind of introduce for us, to really focus efforts on what we can practically do in policy terms and societal terms as well to tackle these issues. So we've got the most fantastic kind of guests here to discuss this issue and our audience as well. So we've got Matt Warman, who's former Minister in DCMS, and Patrick English, the Director of Political Analysis at YouGov. We've got Azora Moores, Policy Lead at Full Fact, and we've got Gaia Marcus, the Director of the Ada Lovelace Institute. So absolutely fantastic speakers for this conversation today. But I'm just going to start by handing over briefly to my colleague Hannah, who's leading our work on epistemic security, to explain why we use this obscure term to describe this work.
I love that every time it gets called obscure. As a former classicist, I love the fact that we've managed to get epistemic into our programme. But yes, epistemic security reflects the importance of knowledge and information to our society, treating information and infrastructure that supports and facilitates infrastructure as a precious resource, much like oil or water. So we think it's particularly important to democracy, information that we have access to, that we use to make decisions, to deliberate with one another. It means that we can have a shared sense of reality and ensure that our conversations are building from the same common platform. And the way that we think about epistemic security, recognising that the information ecosystem can feel like quite an amorphous, sometimes overwhelming space, we break it down into a supply chain. So we think about information production, so where is our news coming from, where is the information, how is it being produced, and is that sustainable? Our information distribution, so recognising the platforms that disseminate that information and what role the algorithms that are intrinsic to those platforms, what role they play. And then finally, information evaluation or decision making. So what skills do we need, or what cues do we need to really evaluate that information in a way that supports our decision making? But why are we so focused about this now? So really recognising the kind of decades of digitalisation that have happened across our information supply chain, but also crucially the centralisation of power throughout that supply chain. So recognising that so many of the platforms that distribute our information now are owned overseas, so they are US headquartered or Chinese, and thinking about what risks and vulnerabilities that creates to how we distribute and receive our information. But also recognising the near collapse of local news ecosystems, so remembering just how crucial news, the accountability of journalism, but also local information that reflects back communities where they live, recognising that the business models that underpin local news have been fundamentally threatened through the digitalisation of that business model. And what does that mean for democracy? And then thirdly, and I've got 4 here, third is around recognising just how slow the pace of legislation necessarily is. So even if we arrive at really strong legislation, it's really difficult to catch up. So at the moment, Online Safety Act is one that I think we recognise still has some gaps and that we're working on, but has been very slow to come into force. The Digital Markets Competition Consumer Act, another one that still there's a lot of time to see how that will reflect fair competition for publishers. And for tech companies. And then the AI bill, hopefully one that we will see in the future, but still one that is difficult to see in terms of its scope. but finally recognising the geopolitical challenges that we face, the level of foreign interference or even platform interference, if we're to think about certain platforms and the role they play in our democracy now. These are all challenges that we think really push us to focus on epistemic security, and particularly given the difficult challenges that lay ahead with us, the policy decisions and the trade-offs that we need to negotiate with the public. So these are all questions that I know the panel will be very well placed to tackle, but across a whole range of policy areas from digital, media and education. And I think we'll really get into the heart of it this morning.
Brilliant, thank you Hannah, and thanks so much. I'm going to go straight to Patrick, because YouGov has done some polling on this, and I just wanted, we at Demos we care about bringing kind of people's voices into policy making, engaging citizens in the process of doing policy, so we're very, very keen to kind of bring the public view into this. So Patrick, you've done some polling on this.
I certainly have indeed, yes. It's no secret really that AI and technology is an area of a bit of controversy within public opinion. There's a lot of people that are excited about it, a lot of people are concerned about it, and as with any sort of new and emerging trend or new and emerging tech, people are concerned about the impact of all these changes on information spaces, their own information, how information is shared and how information is disseminated, understood, and sort of consumed, and in various spaces where that is done. So we asked a representative sample of 2,300 Great British adults to what extent, if at all, they were worried about a range of possible potential tech sort of powered or tech driven outcomes in sort of information space, and be that spaces which they're in or where they get their news or their information from. And what we found is that people are very worried about the potential of foreign states trying to influence UK democracy through online information channels. It was 71% of the public said that they were either very or fairly worried about this potential threat, and only 14% said they weren't really that bothered about it. We also found that they're very worried about hate speech on social media and the impact that that might have, 71% to 22%. They're very worried about deep fakes impersonating MPs and other political actors, 77% to 16%. Somewhat less, but still a little bit worried about free speech being limited by regulations on social media algorithms. So while they are concerned about it, it's not clear that sort of regulating algorithms is the answer that the public wants. That was 60% to 30% were concerned about that versus not concerned. And they were pretty worried about demographic profiling being used to target and curate the kind of content which they see, 65% to 27%. So really I think what we can see there is a characterization of, well, let's be frank, concern on the part of the public around the use of technology and its sort of interaction with information spaces which they are in and where they get their information from. But as polling that we presented last week at Labour Party conference showed, it's not the case that the public is simply concerned about all uses of technology, even within information spaces. So we asked in advance of the Labour Party conference, around a similar amount of people, what they thought about the use of technology in the health service. We found actually people were more disposed to be excited than worried about things like using AI to help book appointments, to anticipate demands and pressure on healthcare services, to flag perhaps early instances of care not being right or not being correct or not being administered properly. So it's not the case that people are just blanket concerned about everything, but there is clearly, I think, a lot of concern about particularly online information spaces and the role that technology, or maybe more the misrole perhaps of technology, in that environment.
Brilliant, thank you. And it's great to have that kind of original and new insights kind of feed into this conversation. And interesting to hear that nuance, particularly, and less the subject of this, but digital ID is kind of coming up as a very political issue within all of this. Matt, I want to come to you next. Like, how concerned are you now compared to a year ago about the quality of information feeding our democracy?
So I think on the one hand, it is true that there is more to worry about now, whether that is a consequence of what's coming out of Russia, whether that's a consequence of people's generalised distrust of information as a result of, depending on your point of view, the good or bad behaviour of the US president. There are lots more things to worry about. On the other hand, the other side of it is, I think, that there is more work being done about it, not least by them, and YouGov and various other people. And there is more awareness in the public. So I think that sort of do you trust anything that you see is infinitely corrosive, but on the other hand, it is a counterbalance to some of what we're seeing. The more important question is, what can you do about it? And I always sort of think back to when the king, the previous king, not the current one, this is not a breaking news announcement. When the king died, then just to be clear, exactly. Bad, I think, then on the one hand you had an unregulated, self-regulated press. On the other hand, the palace got all the editors in and said, could you just hold off on the announcement because we want it to get in the morning papers rather than the evening ones, so that we can just get our act together. That is so unimaginable compared to where we are now. And you could make a perfectly reasonable argument that the sort of a group of men, all men, in having a conversation in whichever palace it was is really bad for democracy. But the other side of it is having that worst case scenario option was available then and it isn't available now. You don't have a sort of, short of literally turn everything off, you don't have a way of trying to get a grip on the genie that is now out of the bottle. So I think when it comes to what can you do about it, what you have to think about is a sort of whole system response, which is a mixture of what does regulation look like, what does better public awareness look like, what does media literacy look like, all of that. And of course, people are going to be more positive about can you use AI in radiotherapy in the NHS and all that than they are about deepfakes. But they are fundamentally quite different problems, and the government response has to choose between a world where we used to say, when it came to information in its broadest possible sense, self-regulation was the only way to do it because you didn't want the government running the media. That was a sort of settled view. Now, the whole idea of that's okay because the media will regulate itself responsibly, clearly 5 minutes on X or less, or Meta or wherever, demonstrates that doesn't work anymore. And so to me, there is a sort of irrefutable, inevitable case for greater intervention. And we do not know what that looks like. And no one has any good ideas because it all ends up with, well, the government's got more of an involvement in the media. And when I was Minister for Disinformation during the 2019 election, then I expressed a sort of vague interest, since I thought it was my job, in sort of could I get a sense from the officials of what the state of disinformation was at that moment? Like, how much should we be worried? And to some extent, it was a cabinet office job rather than my job, but it was very much that there were several ministers that should all have been involved. The civil service was incredibly hesitant, rightly, about giving politicians any kind of access to that kind of, because you would say, okay, well, this is bad, we should do something about it. The officials were very hesitant about opening that Pandora's box. And I think on the one hand, that's absolutely right. On the other, in the round, in as calm a way as possible, we have to think about what that more meaningful regulation looks like. And Demos's work, others' work, is a part of trying to flesh out what that might be. But it is all profoundly different from the world that we've all grown up.
Yeah, so many issues in that I'd love to unpack it during the conversation. Conversation around regulation, crisis response, I think, is kind of really key in this, and then the kind of citizen responsibility in this, media literacy, how we kind of upgrade people's ability to weather these environments, and so we'll touch back on all of those. And of course, particularly here at Conservative Party, all the very knotty issues around free speech as well. Azura, should we pick up on some of those themes? Like, what are your reflections on what that's?
I mean, I don't want to disagree so soon into the panel. I think it's a small thing. But I think something Matt said, just a few minutes ago, was that no one has any good ideas. And, well, Matt, I've got to tell you, we've got some great ideas of what needs to be done. I mean, full fact demos, I'm sure plenty of people in the audience too. I think the problem is not
I should have said solutions.
Yeah, okay. Now you're rolling back, it's fine. I think the problem is not that no one has any good ideas. I think the problem is currently that the government is unable to really say how bad the problem is for fear of what's going on in the United States. I think we have to acknowledge that to begin with. We had J.D. Vance coming to Europe and saying that misinformation was a Soviet-era word. Misinformation isn't a Soviet-era word. Misinformation isn't a clampdown on free speech, and I think the problem we have really when we're talking about this issue, we're talking about the information environment, is that no one really wants to assess how bad the situation currently is. Now, Full Fact is an independent fact-checking organisation. We have been running for 15 years, and I would say have a fairly good understanding of the landscape of misinformation. And let me be frank and not to fearmonger, the situation's pretty dire at the moment. Just last week you had the US president saying that paracetamol caused autism. Things like this aren't things that we want to be saying here in public. And I think actually that's really where the problem has to start, is an understanding that actually we don't just need one solution, we need to urgently all come together and find a solution to this problem because it's so rapid. Now, where do I think we should start? For me, at Full Fact, I think really elections is where we need to start focusing our attention. That is ultimately the biggest fundamental threat to democracy if we start to see misinformation infiltrating the election environment. So, the upcoming elections bill, let's start to really think about what more we can do there. For me, I think there's a really interesting question that we're lowering the voting age to 16, we're giving young people, newly enfranchised people, the chance to vote, but we're not telling them or giving them any skills as to how to spot misinformation, how to vote fairly, how to assess sources, how to look at deepfakes. I mean, I thought your statistic there, Patrick, around 77 people are concerned about deepfakes. 77 is a huge number, that's a huge percentage. But we're sort of saying, 77%. No, let's say it's 77% of people are really worried. Well, if 77% of people were impacted by deepfakes, that would change the course of an election. So I do think there is a really serious question about reassessing how bad is the problem, how urgently do we need to act, and how seriously do we all need to come together and find that multi-pronged solution that you were suggesting.
And what would that urgency look like for you?
I think it would be an election bill coming up pretty soon. I mean, we're hoping for November. I think it would have an election bill that includes measures against political deepfakes. It would look at digitising the way our elections are fought and really making sure that we're not just thinking about how misinformation impacts a postal election, but impacts a digital election as well. I mean, we've got a lot of solutions. I don't want to sort of monopolise the time here, but I think we have to understand that we're no longer fighting elections in the post box, we're fighting them online. So what does that mean? That means our political adverts need to be regulated better. They need to be stored better so that we can look back at them. We need to know who paid for political adverts. What is such a massive question. Was that foreign money? Was that money here in the UK? Were algorithms being boosted? Who paid for algorithmic boosts on certain election ads? Those are all really important issues that we don't have the answers to yet.
What is an election ad?
There we go. Right. There we go. All these questions that we're not really answering at the moment because we're saying, we're talking about a lot of important issues with the elections. We're talking about harassment. Let's talk about digital harassment. Those are massive issues that we need to be thinking about. So, urgent interventions start with calling the problem what it is and moving legislation, thoroughly and quickly so that we can start to answer this question.
Just very quickly, it's worth saying though that there is right now plenty of legislation, not sufficient, that is nowhere near being enforced. So there's a huge enforcement gap, regardless of what you do with new legislation.
Yeah.
I hear people talking about kind of information ecosystem collapse in America and that we are kind of stages behind. Do you subscribe to that kind of analysis?
No, I think it's pretty bad here as well, to be honest with you. I think we, at Full Fact, we fact check information and misinformation that's really relevant here to the UK. And I think the situation is also bad. I think there's lots of ways in which our press is regulated that maybe avoid some of the concerns in the US, but actually the information people are privy to is pretty bad here.
I think the public would also be signaling that they think it's pretty bad as well.
Yeah.
So all these numbers, as you say, 77 is a huge number. You rarely ever see those kind of numbers in polling at all.
I'll be taking those later, definitely.
The key message so far is it's bad.
Look like they're a solution.
But but also, Gaia, kind of coming to you next, we are also on the precipice of another wave of technological change that is profound and not yet understood. Kind of how is AI going to, before the next election, make this situation change?
Yeah, I oversee the Ada Lovelace Institute. We do a lot of thinking about the role of AI and data in ensuring that our society is now people protected. And so I've taken a bit of a step back, which is possibly a problem because I've come after Azorda who's gone right into it. But I think it can be quite helpful to take a quick step back. So thinking about kind of the role of AI in knowledge creation, I had 4 quick, hopefully, thoughts. So firstly, I think we need to be really cognizant of what the current Gen AI paradigm does to our knowledge stores. So you've got this hoovering up of information and knowledge in training very indiscriminately, which is then largely played back to you at a layer of abstraction from the creation of original knowledge. Be that through, say, AI summaries, where often you no longer actually have to go to the website of the person that creates that original knowledge, or through what are known as hallucinations, so where a lot of AI systems have been trained to give references, and often those references aren't real. So it's facsimile information with no real kind of care really for the truth. If you go on X at the moment and you search for Ada Lovelace Institute, we're not there anymore. You find that Grok has, I think, in post-training, been trained to basically give Ada Lovelace Institute as a kind of almost like a punctuation point to references that may or may not be true. So there's a real thing in actually the way in which they're quite plausible, but I can often not actually link them to reports that we've written. So there's just something there of actually people being played back almost a pastiche of knowledge, which I think does really almost break those underpinnings of what truth is. And so in this kind of era of best next word prediction, which is where we are in the current state of AI, we really need to think about what's been done to the actual concept of truth. Like many of you, I suspect, I started out in humanities, and I was very much drilled in the idea that a well-formed argument tends to tell you something about the quality of the argument, and that is just no longer true. Just because something is well written and well argued, it almost does the opposite, because kind of next word prediction systems, which is what we're seeing with Gen AI at the moment, are very, very good at almost distilling a compelling form of argument, but the truth bases aren't there anymore. And I think there's just something where we're even seeing Gen AI tools use fact checking, which I'm sure is something that you guys have a lot of views on. I don't know if you've been at parties where people will pull out Grok and use Grok to fact check it. So there's just really something in terms of both the way knowledge is being assimilated and played back, and then actually it breaks the ways that we were taught to understand whether something could be trusted or not. And then I think the other thing I'm really worried about is atomization. So as a species, our ability to make sense of the world is a kind of communal and embodied act. So sense making is something that tends to require community. You say things, you understand whether or not those things can be trusted by people's reaction to them. What we're seeing at the moment is Gen AI models that are very personable. So people are using these systems almost as interlocutors, often psychophantic interlocutors. And there seems to be a real risk in our work on advanced AI systems that these might be the main way that people deal with the internet. And so most of the information is going to come in a kind of singularity through this one tool that is made to keep you on the tool, is not really made to give you truth. And so I think there's a real issue where, beyond kind of the commercial interest question of an AI agent being the main way that you get information, because these will be a couple of companies, they will have commercial relationships with the people that they feed information to, for example, from. But there's a real problem that if people are mainly accessing and interacting with the internet through a very, very personalised tool, that can lead to an increased atomization of the kind of knowledge sources and kind of sphere of information that they're dealing with. And I think this kind of gatekeeping power that these advanced AI assistants could exert is something we should be really thinking about just truth and knowledge in our communities. And then I think, and we started to touch on this, we're really seeing that technology is both outstripping our ability to govern it. So I don't know if anyone has seen the Soros 2, the launch of the video tools that happened over the weekend in the US. You've now got the ability to create incredibly compelling videos where the kind of uncanny valley we used to have, where you could more or less tell that something was AI generated, is being left behind. And we don't really have regulation for this. And I think when you come into thinking about the governance of these spaces, you've got both our attempts to govern and technology really out of step, but also our governors, our politicians often out of step with what the public expects. So throwing around another 72% stat, our most recent nationally represented survey with almost 1,000 people on what the public would need to be comfortable with AI shows that 72% of people would like to see regulation in the space. That's up 10% since the last 2 years. So there's just something there where you've got this double step of removal where because we're leaning into kind of growth and progress narratives, we have a political class internationally generally that are very reluctant to go to regulate or kind of go to head with tech companies, and they're actually both moving out step with their populations, but also out the capabilities of this technology.
Brilliant, thank you. I want to drill into a few areas that have come up already. First being kind of crisis response. So be it during an election, when fake information may be circulating, or in circumstances like we saw last summer in Southport, and how the authorities and society kind of responds in those moments. Matt, what was your experience of that when you were in government, and what can we learn from that?
So I think at the end of the day, there isn't a crisis protocol that works. Like there isn't currently a legal framework or anything consistent and meaningful that says this is what primarily social networks, but the media as a whole is a sensible response. And that's because there has been a huge unwillingness to have that conversation. It is, on the other hand, true that, for instance, in the aftermath of the Capitol riots, the social networks were asked and eventually agreed to, for want of a better phrase, sort of turn down the algorithmic temperature. And that is, on the one hand, arguably that's good. I'm not sure what the argument is for ever turning up the algorithmic temperature. So I think there is a sort of, in the same way that we have responsible publishers in around the world, at the end of the day, I think you do in some ways just have to confront the fact that the modern social network is an irresponsible publisher. And so how do you regulate that? Well, we can have sort of all sorts of technical conversations and all that, but that has to be your starting point. That comes straight back to the regulation of the press, or whatever you want to call it. So to actually answer your question, what's a proportionate response in a crisis look like? It depends, obviously, on the crisis. If you've got people that are sort of literally threatening to burn down hotels, your primary response is not around social media, it's around the thing that's in front of you. So really, and it's why elections are sort of in this bracket, it's how do you prevent it in the first place? At which point, you're back to regulating social media. So it's sort of, I think in some ways we obviously need a crisis protocol, we obviously need that to be part of the toolkit, but if we focus on that, we've lost sight of how we've got there, and that's the problem. I'm not sure, if I'm honest, that you could ever get to a point where you couldn't reasonably justify almost anything as a crisis. So it's sort of like, how do you tackle disinformation about climate change, for instance? Well, there are lots of people that would say that's a permanent crisis. So I think there is a danger of sort of saying we're going to try and chop off the worst bits rather than fix the plan.
Zara, you're going to think about this with Hannah as well. So that you want to...
Matt, we're going to disagree the whole panel. It's good for us. We'll make a laugh. It's fine. At Full Fact, we have developed something called a framework for information instances, and actually, it does address the challenge you have, which is it creates levels of crisis. So obviously, no crisis is the same, and therefore no response should be the same. So you have 1 to 5, 5 being Southport, the pandemic, things that are causing actual harm to people's lives if they aren't getting everyone together and saying we need a unified response here. So I think something we have been really pushing for in this environment is making sure the right people are talking to each other and the right voices are amplified. And that really is the problem we have at the moment in a crisis. Everyone's kind of doing their own thing. And when people are acting in good faith, that's fine. But actually, that isn't fine, because what we really do need to see is the right voices being amplified. So I obviously work for a fact-checking organisation, so I'm going to talk about how great I think fact-checkers are. But there are others too. There are experts, there are medical professionals. In the pandemic, for example, it wasn't just fact-checkers' voices that needed to be amplified, it was doctors, it was trusted voices, it was nurses, it was people working at the front line saying, wear a mask, stay inside, take the vaccine, no, don't inject bleach into your blood, into your system. All these things are really important. Now, there is a little bit of progress happening. That Ofcom is currently consulting on a crisis response mechanism. between us friends in the room, it's pretty wishy-washy, it doesn't do quite enough, but more on that in days gone by. But there are other things that can be done in a crisis, and this is work that Hannah and I have been developing and looking at, but really we start to think about what can platforms do in this instance. Now, for those of you who witnessed the riots last year during Southport, if you were online, you probably wouldn't have seen a community note during that period. You wouldn't have seen anything saying, no, that's not true, or actually, here's a bit of information. And Demos has done some brilliant research, and I'm actually going to butcher your statistics, I don't remember off the top of my head.
Might have to bring Hannah in.
Tell me, Hannah, how many community notes were visible during...
12.
12. During a crisis where...
Does everyone know what a community note is? No, Hannah explain, because it is a bit
important.
technical.
Yeah,
but
a
important.
community note it's the system that's exclusive. It's not exclusively used on X now. It's now a system that's being used and rolled out by Meta in the States and also YouTube. But it reflects the need to add context to a note. And the difference at the moment where context is added, what they look for is users, so anyone, not specifically fact checkers, but anyone can write a community note. And then it uses a bridging algorithm to see if different people agree that that note is helpful, which is an incredible bit of technology to assess diverse views to see if everyone agrees that it's helpful. But in a crisis, that takes, in business as usual time, it takes a really long time to find that consensus. It can be 3-4 days. In a crisis like Southport, where people were moving to riot within 8 hours, you need that kind of agreement much faster. And so what was happening with community notes on X was that it was taking too long, and all people weren't finding agreement, and as a result notes weren't published, they weren't visible to users. So yeah, it's the use of that technology in a crisis context which was not working.
Perfect description. But what does that mean in practice? It means that if misinformation is spreading about the riots that says, this person of a specific religious background caused, the stabbing, or actually here is a mosque that was burned down by rioters, there is no mechanism to correct that quickly. Now, I don't need to explain to this audience that misinformation that isn't corrected quickly is never debunked. It spreads to nothing else, and it really means that actually we can't get a hold of it. So alongside a crisis mechanism that does require platforms to come together, expert voices to be amplified, the police to respond in a certain way, we also need these other systems in place, like fixing community notes, so that actually we are starting to counter misinformation quickly at source. And while it might not prevent riots from happening, it might prevent them from spreading, which I think is pretty important.
Yeah. And it's something I know that in those moments, political parties and the platforms are all concerned about this. So during the last election, there were talks between the platforms and the political parties about literally setting up a WhatsApp group to kind of respond to these things.
Yeah.
Why is it so hard to reach agreement on that protocol?
I mean, Matt, maybe that's the
Well, I mean, the answer is at the beginning of what you were saying. You and I absolutely sympathise, but you keep saying the right voices, the right people, and there is fundamentally no agreement. And the traditional view was that the right thing was a plurality of voice.
Yeah.
And if we now go to Facebook or X or Google or whatever, and there is a single version of the truth, then whether it's true or not, then we're in the right pickle.
And I don't dispute that, but I think there are still, and we have to have some shred of agreement that there are expert voices in certain issues.
So that is true. That is absolutely true. Oh, sorry, I should stop holding the conversation. That is absolutely true. But for instance, we've made too many mistakes that undermine that argument. So lots of people would immediately say, "Well, hang on, you spent a long time suppressing the lab leak theory. It's now the consensus that is true." That's because you had the right people making the decision. And you can surround the conspiracy theories with stuff from the NHS, you can do all sorts of things, but it's retrospective, and the atomization that Gaia talked about means that you've already amplified it before you've done it.
Gaia, do you want to
Yeah, I think that we have some real foundational problems in how our information infrastructure is set up at the moment that are really hard to unpick. So from kind of Section 230, we had the idea that online platforms were mere walls, right? So we never held platforms accountable for the content that was on them. We're kind of changing this, but really, once we started having algorithmic recommenders, that meant that a platform's economic motivator was the main reason whether you saw a piece of content or not. We should have changed that. So we are kind of playing catch up with 10 or plus years of not holding platforms responsible for content that's on there. So I think there's something where we almost have the wrong conceptual bases, because it feels to me at the moment that we're in a situation where the flows of our knowledge should be seen as a kind of a critical national infrastructure sector, which we're not really not set up to do. So the concept of CNI in the UK, when you think about assets, we're not very good at our CNI sectors anyway in terms of thinking about supply chains. I think this question of, do we think the flows of information around our economy, our democracy, are sufficiently important to see it as a CNI sector? I think we should. I think there's just something there where it's just we don't have the muscle for that. It's not how we've done it in the past. I think we've got this real issue where you can fact check, but you can't narrative check. So people tend to believe something that sits within their kind of configuration of the world. And so this is one of the really big problems about deepfakes or any other fake information. You're just more likely to trust information that reinforces what you already think about the world. So there's a real problem where, I used to be a network analyst, this is going to turn a bit wonky for a sec, but since we have online platforms and like online networks, we've collapsed people's understanding of what the private and public sphere is. And we've made people very bad at accepting any fact that doesn't correspond to their kind of personal view of the world when it's online. Because then when you are dealing with something online, it feels like it should be in your private sphere. We're very good at dealing with other people's views offline, generally, right? You don't start a fight in pub often because someone disagrees with you. You kind of know what to do it, but we don't have the muscle of what happens when that's in your online space, because your online space feels personal. So I think there are just some really big building blocks to how people navigate the world that aren't quite there. And it's just quite a big topic. But I do think that my personal view has always been that we should be dealing with platforms as if they're utilities, and we obviously don't. And this is the problem. Any approach to kind of national security, essentially, because we're talking about, that is based on a WhatsApp group, and platforms opting in to be part of a WhatsApp group to agree to do something is a real problem. I think the real problem is that actually these aren't utilities, and we just don't regulate or deal with them as such. And that's always going to lead to fraying.
Let's pick up on the point about regulation, because I think it was made earlier that it's been too slow, the technology moves too fast. How do you think we can address that?
I mean, the previous government, so if we think about AI at least, the previous government actually has a very good piece of policy analysis that is somewhere in GSIT around where the regulation space was good enough for dealing with AI and why it wasn't. So one of the problems we have in AI, and I'll let Azura and others come in on more of kind of the information space, but one of the issues that we have with AI, because of the supply chain of AI, where you've got these large foundation models that then are the surface that every other tool is built across, the previous government accepted that there are risks that are created upstream that you can't deal with downstream. And so there's something for me which is, with regulation, the question always has to be, do you have the tools, and this applies to your area as well, do you have the tools to ensure that people are most able to manage the risks of being compelled to do so? I think the answer currently is no. And if you don't have the tools to ensure that people are most able to manage the risks of doing so, then I think that's a regulatory gap that we need to step into.
Matt, how do you reflect on Online Safety Act?
I think the counter argument to some of what's been said is it the case that all of these models, it is not in their interest to get things wrong? It's not actually in their interest to do things that that are obviously factually incorrect. So where the government can regulate, I think you have to assume reasonable and regulatable intent on the part of those major companies, and you can do that at a system level. I do think we're going to really struggle to win an argument that ends up anything other than a version of arm's length self-regulation kind of stuff, because otherwise you have got the government regulating to a microscopic level of detail by comparison to what we had with the arrangement with the sort of old media. So I sort of think you're not, there's a danger of going down a bit of a rabbit hole that says we've got to try and do this and this and this and this, when actually you have to take a sort of high level systemic approach. And you also have to, I think in timescale terms, it wasn't that long ago that videos of the sort that you're talking about had sort of people with 6 fingers. And you could sort of very easily say, well, this is obviously AI generated. The incentive to to make this stuff better is obvious. The potential risk of using it for what are essentially fraudulent or various other illegal purposes are already one way or another regulated. There's space for a gap analysis of the sort that you talked about. But I do think this does have to be fundamentally principles based, because otherwise we're going to go down a rabbit hole that changes society in a way that there isn't democratic consent for.
I mean, things we're already seeing at the moment.
Yeah,
So
no, I agree.
we're seeing technologies that are being just released when you don't have the governance in place. And so, I mean, I think firstly it's worth seeing what's going on in the US. So California is going to be regulating, so I think that actually changes what's doable, because you moved almost the Overton window there. But I think it is, we've got a situation at the moment where I think you're seeing almost mass experimentation.
Yeah,
So the idea that you would release something that can just create a whole new narrative in a way that we are not able, you've got the little Soro, if you haven't seen these videos, they're actually really impressive. So they've got like little Soro kind of like, what they're called, watermarks that move around. But I mean, I used to edit videos. There's nothing actually stopping you doing like a frame, edit and taking the watermarks off. It would take a very long time. But I think we've got to the point where we have to accept that we need to do something, because also not regulating is a choice. That is a regulatory choice as well. And if that is the regulatory choice that this government wants to make, or the opposition wants to push this government to make, that's fine.
So I don't think anyone's saying we shouldn't do anything. But I think the question, the sort of key question is, what is the intended outcome that you really want? And who do you think is best placed to deliver it? And it is much more of a public-private partnership than it's ever been before. And that's one of the sort of other, in the sense of everything has shifted, is the atomization is different, the perception of it from a business sort of lens is different, the capability is different, the scale is different, all of that stuff we've never had to deal with this before. And so there is, I suppose there is there's a constant bit in the back of my head that says, if we get this wrong now, you have changed those foundations in a way that, and I'm not some libertarian free speech maniac by any means, but I do think you have to think about the consequences and try and predict the unintended consequences in a way that we've never had to before. So I think the risk is just as great as the need.
I'm keen to come back before we round up on the issues around citizen responsibility and education and this all. And I know this is a whistle-stop tour of the whole. But before I move on to that, I just wanted to give a chance to open up to the audience. Is there anyone who wanted to come in on any of those points?
I feel obligated, right?
Yeah. Do you want to introduce yourself?
I'm Casey, and I work for Meta. And only for 6 months, I wasn't around during some of the things that we're talking about. But I guess more just to contribute to the discussion and throw a question back to the panel is for the bigger platforms, right? Because we have more resources. A lot of the stuff that we're talking about already exists. So like collaboration with the police forces, with government, being able to pull experts in extremely quickly to like target our response. Even things like Azure, what you were talking about before, we have like a political ad transparency center, that things are saved, there's disclosures, you need to say who things were paid for by. So like a lot of this stuff that we're talking about does exist, and I'm not saying everything is perfect, but obviously when we're talking about content moderation in a really broad sense, there's this really interesting thing where we also have like society changes and expectations change, and so I don't think on a personal level, I don't think we want to move to a single content removal kind of country. But when I'm thinking, trying to take a step back, because I think that's more useful, even thinking about the Demos report, and Hannah can correct me if I'm mischaracterizing, she can fact check me, I'll say, if I'm mischaracterizing this, but in outside of crisis situation, which obviously moves much faster, they have found that community notes actually engender more trust from the reader. So I guess there's like just a really interesting push and pull here around the information ecosystem, the really super low levels of trust right now, and how we combat that and how we think about that. Like, and I'm talking really broad sense, like all of us as a society, like what is kind of the right solution? Is it to silence some voices? Are we then potentially like having unintended consequences of pushing people to much less regulated platforms, to platforms without a lot of the tools that we're talking about? And like, how do we get that kind of like almost national conversation back and kind of start ourselves out on the same foot? But at the same time, the other thing that's in the back of my mind is that we're talking very much on like a national level, right? So if we do some regulation with the Online Safety Act, like that's going to affect us here in the UK. How many internets do we think is acceptable? All right, we already have like arguably 3 or 4 globally. Like as we start to move down this path potentially of regulation, in terms of like different countries saying what's acceptable and not acceptable on their platforms, if geo-blocking becomes much more of a used thing, we lose that thing that we have right now, where we're able to have these like, you know, international/regional conversations with each other, and like how extreme does that end up getting? And I'm just curious to thoughts when we're talking about trust in the context of like where we are geopolitically, but then also where we are in terms of who we believe in the media narrative. Like, what's the best way to win this back? Really big questions that probably no one can answer, but I'm interested in like how you're starting to think about balance these things.
So I think in lots of ways the debate becomes a boil the ocean debate immediately.
Yeah.
Like, it's a sort of how do you win back trust in politics? Well, politicians should make promises that they keep. Like, well, great, but that's we can't fix that today. And so I think you do, which is why you end up saying, well, okay, we need to do some relatively micro, compared to that problem, regulation. And it's sort of, I do, despite some of what I've said, I do think we have to make a decision to do something and get on with it. We can't sit there forever and be like, well, this is hard, so we won't. But at the same time, we need to do that with an appropriate degree of sort of caution and limitation, because otherwise it goes wrong too quickly.
Good question. How much access do third-party organisations have to the algorithms that are used on Meta, and what that does to the information? Because I think something that we've seen, I think a third-party assurance ecosystem is actually really interesting. Because say the kind of YouTube thing we used to have where if you put on a video of like the space landing and you left it for a while, I did try this at the time when I was running National Data Strategy, you came back and there was something like flat earthers and like the space landing was a hoax. And that was just the algorithm wanting to drive you to more and more content that you've watched for longer and longer. It took about half an hour from memory, I think I made a cup of tea and disappeared for a bit. So there's something about what can we do to ensure that the algorithms that companies are using to drive profit, as they have a right to do, aren't having unintended consequences on the information environment. Wellness, for example, as I'm sure people in the room will know, had this like weird link into conspiracy theorists.
Yes.
So my little sister got COVID once, many times, but one time she got COVID went to party with old school friends. A lot of them had gone massively into like wellness and crystals, her words, not mine, and they just didn't believe in vaccinations as well. They didn't believe in stopping the spread. And so you have this thing where it's not just the information, the singular quantum of information that needs thinking about. It's how then these knowledge artifacts almost link together, and you just start getting these. It's a big problem, but I think the more we have transparency around almost the connections between bits of information and how, again, the algorithms that are used to push information to people are impacting on that. I think we need to have that more. And I don't think a situation where you can go, well, I've just taken down that one bit of information is actually that helpful, because it's not the one bit of information. It's the information situated in some matter network.
How can we help citizens to understand that, not as an alternative to regulation, all the other things that need to be done, but to kind of complement that?
I mean, this is straying out of the work that we do, but I think something we've seen in our work with young people is that I always get a bit nervous when you kind of say that like education is the answer. But I think what we're very much seeing with our young people is that they're not currently being equipped with the tools to navigate the world that they've been put into. So a quote that we had with one of our young people that we did research with that I hate myself as a mother is really like has just stuck with me. So we have a person who's now I think 20, and as a 14-year-old, the big trend at school was to do these Reddit 50/50 challenges. I don't know if anyone's done this. I only use Reddit in safer work mode. I don't know why. I've never done the 18+. It's a cesspool basically. So the 50/50 challenge, you have a 50/50 chance of seeing a kitten or someone being beheaded. That's the kind of level of content. And you've got this 14-year-old, they're now 20, I think, this child that did it as a, like, we're not protecting them because we don't know it's there. Does that make any sense? So there's something for me of, this is not a solution, but we have very much engendered a world that is not safe for children and young people, let alone for the rest of us. And I think we need to be able to find routes in where it's not enough to just allow that information to us, because it's having really negative effects.
I think at its heart, imperfectly implemented, whatever, at its heart, the Online Safety Act made a choice that we will protect children and vulnerable people at the ever so slight expense of free speech. And the world has gone mildly crazy, or bits of the world have gone mildly crazy, at apparently that enormous infringement on free speech. But I would, when it was my bill, I would always make the case that I would rather continue with the very long established, somewhat impediments on free speech that have been around for centuries in order to protect children. And the online version of that is not in principle any different. It's also, by the way, worth remembering that if you ask the public, it is way more popular to protect children and young people from getting eating disorders than it is to have an absolutely unfettered attitude to all of this stuff. So I think there is a real danger of losing sight of what actually matters here. But what the government, I think, got wrong, and the previous government got wrong, is the impression that things like the Online Safety Act are a silver bullet and will fix everything. And I was always I remember doing an APVG meeting in the Lords, and there was a sort of, remember, this is all very bad, and I think just being explicit and saying this is a 51-49% choice, and 51 is better than 49, and like that's where we're at with lots of this.
But I think what we've forgotten is it was always designed to be an evolving document, and I think we left it stagnant as is. And Guy, you mentioned all these new emerging risks, all these new emerging technologies. Where's that conversation still? Because we're still worrying about, what happened when the bill was passed, and those slight infringements of free speech. We're not looking forward. We're not looking forward at emerging risks, and I think that is ultimately where we need to be thinking. We also talk a lot about, is this a question of protecting children? What about old people?
So actually,
what about vulnerable people?
Well, not even vulnerable people. I mean, if you think that the internet is damaging children, wait till you hear about adults.
Yeah.
Thing like that. That's the big problem.
Was there any data on age in the YouGov work,
Oh,
sorry.
I had three things rattling around in my head, and annoyingly that wasn't one of them. But so generally, when we look at anything to do with tech, sort of anything to do with AI, anything to do with sort of information space, young people tend to sort of lean into the it's more exciting than worrying, or it's more kind of there's more opportunities than concern into it, and I think that's broadly going to be how much you cross that data is probably the story you're going to get, and sort of the older generation tend to be much more concerned about it. But the three quick things I wanted to kind of jump in on. One was, you're absolutely right, and I think the gap between sort of political commentary and the public was on excellent display around the Online Safety Act, because however you polled it, people were like, yes, this is great, and like a lot of the political debate felt a lot more sort of 50-50, that just was not the case amongst the general public. The other quick thing I wanted to point out, two of three, is when we talk about young voters, and this is a point I quite like to make a lot of times, particularly when the legislation was coming through to reduce the voting age. The youngest voters at the next general election, if it's going to be when it's scheduled to be, which I think more than likely is, are currently 12 years old. So if we're thinking about, how do we make sure that the youngest voters are best equipped, it's not even current 16-year-olds, not even current 14-year-olds that needs to be looking at, it's current 12-year-olds and 13-year-olds.
I've got a 12-year-old, that is terrible.
When I tweeted this, that was most people's comment to it. It's like, oh my God, I've had 12-year-olds, so that's quite interesting to hear. The other thing that so we've sort of spoken a little bit about trust and a little bit about trusted voices and trusted actors. And it was really interesting to me. I sort of had a sudden memory of some polling that we did in August of last year, just after the riots and just after a lot of the fallout from that was really starting to hit the headlines. And the survey that we did at the time found another 70%, lots further 70%, 70% in favour of more regulation. 2/3 said that social media companies should be held accountable for what is on their platforms. But what interested me is that 86% of people said that social media companies and platforms had to take some responsibility for what happened during the riots and the spread of misinformation in them. But also that 69% said the same thing of traditional media companies. So it isn't the case that there's some sort of like big sort of disconnect, but big breakers where people think, traditional media is fine, there's no problems there. Online media is it's a cesspit and we need to deal with it. There's a wider thing, I think, about information, about how information is shared, how information is distributed, and how much people trust all forms and all sort of actors within the information sharing space, not just online.
Although, it reminds me, Polly, we hosted an event a few months ago with Marie Breslin, the editor of the Politico, and she was saying actually after and during and after the Southwark riots, these were a huge increase in their traffic of people turning to local news sources. You know, I think we can't forget, you know, we're talking quite big, we're talking quite national here, but actually people still want to hear from their local paper in moments like this. They want
And
to
we
hear.
haven't got into the whole issue
I mean,
of
we haven't even got
the
into that
decimation
yet.
of that sector, but I was just keen if there were any more thoughts, reflections from the audience, anyone wants to come in? All two. I'll start, I saw you first, and then gentleman at the back.
My name's Ailsa McIntosh. I work with corporate affairs with BBC, and I used to be a programme maker as well, so I've got that content background. And it's just really interesting hearing what you're all talking about. And obviously, we've been in existence for 100 years, so we're not a new media. But our trust stats are still phenomenal. Despite the various things that go on and the scandals that happen, our trust stats are above 50%, which is phenomenal, because the nearest ones are in sort of single figures. And I suppose my plea would be that what we might want to describe as legacy media, but I would still see this as the sort of future of media, because mess with that at your peril, because what it is and what it represents is a very regulated form of source. And I know that again, there's a lot of discussion happens about how you make sure that government is not so involved with the BBC, but equally the regulation, and we should be regulated because we're funded by the public. But that actually, I think, works because we're super accountable. We have to, you should see our news people go at our Director General. Like, nobody holds back more, they just absolutely go for anything. So I think that the fact that we've got our charter coming up, I think the things that we're doing in this area, like BBC Verify, which is really trying to sort of open source, show the workings, and all the stuff we're doing on media literacy, which is all of these things, and the fact that we're used by, across the week, by 85%, and that includes young people, and 95% across the month. And our stats with young people are phenomenal in terms of we do go onto YouTube, we put news around on YouTube, we try to do things to make sure that we're where we should be. But my plea would be that with the charter coming up, often we get caught up in culture wars, but actually we're part of the answer here, we're part of the solution, and we actually exist. And there's a sort of slight fear that it can be kind of overlooked because of the sort of focus going to all the new media, but we're actually part of how we will educate, because the trust exists, people are using us, we're regulated, we're accountable, and we're working in these areas. We were very nervous about AI, so we're very kind of cautious on that, but we still see some potential. So for instance, it could help us access some of our archive that actually is really difficult for us to archive, because you need modern eyes looking at old content to see whether it's appropriate. But that's a really good use of AI. We're using it, maybe if we have sports things that are happening at local level, we can have that made into sort of something which can be read and be online. We invest in local democracy reporters, which I think has been a really useful thing. When we first started doing that, we got a lot of criticism that we would actually be undermining local democracy, but actually that was the sort of the difficulty for finding advertising and the sort of the funds to keep local democracy going is such a challenge. That story has completely changed. We now have a lot of politicians who say without local democracy reporting that we're investing in, it wouldn't exist. So I think there's a lot of answers that are actually, I think we're in quite a privileged position in the UK. But I guess my plea would be, with the charter coming up, with World Service, that would be another thing I would say, is that World Service used to be funded obviously through the government, now 3/4 of it funded through the licence fee, and we spend about 400 million on World Service, which is used by over 450 million abroad. But China and Russia alone are spending 6 to 8 billion on not very trusted international stories, and as soon as, because of money we might pull out of something, so we've pulled out of Persian radio, we've gone online, but we've pulled out of that frequency, that's been taken by Russia. So there are very, very real risks with information, and I guess what I'm saying is that there's going to be very, very active conversations about the Charter over the next 2 years, and sometimes we don't do ourselves any favour by risking the actual brand of the BBC. It should be absolutely, we should be held accountable, but actually it's such a trusted source, and really we mess with it at our peril.
Just very quickly, huge fan of the BBC. It does amazing work. It's proof that regulation works. Like
Yeah.
that is a good thing. It is, however, also true that there are worrying signs at the fringes, whether it's the licence fee going down by 300,000 people a year, that stuff. I absolutely, when I was knocking on doors in my former patch, I absolutely had typically 50, 60-year-old men and women bringing up the fact that they only watch GB News because they don't trust the BBC. And GB News has many qualities, but it is not the BBC. And that is really corrosive. And I think it is, we have to find our way through that conundrum, because otherwise we will lose a lot of that stuff. And it's not just everyone worries about children getting news on YouTube. It's, for me, it's much more about their parents and grandparents, even though the numbers are small right now.
Thank you for that.
Hi, Arthur Virgo, Digital Policy Alliance. I'm remembering the Parliamentary Office of Science and Technology report about misinformation, saying that support for more trustworthy sources is a better way of addressing misinformation because of some of the free speech philosophical positions that are common in Europe, making it a challenge to directly confront people's, what they might say is their beliefs. What ideas might the panellists have about ways that trustworthy sources could be supporters? We've mentioned the BBC a moment ago, but I was thinking Wikipedia, which is decentralised, or the idea of watermarking genuine content that's produced by a real camera or audio recording, which I've heard spoken of before as a potential way of confronting the fact that deepfakes will become widespread.
Mm-hmm. I'm reminded of some research we're publishing later this year, which is about young people and their social media habits and how it drives their understanding of the world and politics and the future. And one thing that came up again and again was young people saying, yeah, I see stuff, but I always check it against the BBC. That, like, the second sourcing kind of point. And actually what struck us in that research with young people is just how alive to these issues and being kind of hoodwinked by information young people are. Do you want to pick up on that?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, you know, my company would kill me if I'm not here pushing fact checkers, and I think they still play a really vital role. There was a big story just last week which claimed that Ewan Blair was going to have a role in pushing out digital IDs. I mean, totally untrue. We fact checked that at the time. It's spread really widely until we were able to partner with really trusted journalists who amplified the source even further. And actually, there was a claim made on the BBC, it's now been taken down. So, and I think that's a really good example of what I mean when I talk about trusted voices. It has to be a working in partnership effort. So you can have experts, you can have fact checkers working with journalists as well. One of the things I think we didn't really touch on when we talked about community notes is where those trusted voices could also be put into a community notes system. So put into technological models that allow their voices to be amplified. Hannah mentioned a bit about the Southport riots and how really only 12 notes were visible. That's because people couldn't reach consensus. Okay, what about in a crisis if we say, let's not just reach consensus, let's put up a note quickly and amplify trusted voices. So for me, I think there's a lot of work there we can do. In deepfakes, the point you mentioned, I think it's actually not as simple as a trusted voice says this isn't correct. I think actually that's where we need to look at the scope and the bounds of the law. One of the things we're pushing out with the upcoming elections bill is there is a law called the Representations of the People's Act. It is a really old law. I actually believe it gave women the right to vote, but don't check me on that because I'm not certain. And within that, there is a sort of clause that you can't defame someone. You can't say that someone said something that they didn't say. But that's what a deepfake does. That's exactly what a deepfake does. It says, you know, you have made a statement and actually they didn't. But there is nothing in that law that says, but deepfakes are included. It's just sort of a woolly old law. And I think to me, it's about also using the bounds of the law to say what works, what doesn't, and where can we modernise to fight some of these problems as well. So, sorry, I've taken your answer, and one was one of the points I really wanted to make. But I do think there's a lot to be said about, you know, we need to amplify trusted voices, we need to educate young people, we need to look at regulation, we need to look at bounds of the law as well.
Guy, do you want to add something on algorithms in that?
I mean, there is technical work that's trying to understand how far you can watermark synthetic content. So this is, I know it's something that the AEC, the AI Security Institute, are looking into. I think with all technical responses, you are going to fundamentally get the problem of, like, do people have the muscle to check knowledge or not? Because I think if you think about in the States, which is often a good bellwether of where things are going, There was obviously fake information that was published that was using deep fakes used very lightly. Anyone looking at the video for more than 2 seconds would have realised it was fake, but people share it if it backs up what they want to see in the world. So I think there's a kind of technical response, but there's also just the fact that when you have heightened sensibilities and atomization between people's views, people will just trust what they think they know already. And that's quite a big societal problem, that there won't just be a technical response to.
Matt, final thought?
Yeah, and also I think sort of some, say for instance, I think it was Tucker Carlson, sort of when confronted with a deepfake, his response was like, well, that's what he would have said. It's the sort of thing he would have said.
It's more as a journey.
Yeah, exactly. So I think we've got all of this stuff comes back to trust, and you can watermark stuff as much as you like. You can do it. You quite quickly run into what's satire and what's art and all of that. But I do think that all that you are going, if you look for an endless sort of whack-a-mole technical solutions thing, you're always going to be saying, well, we're too far behind, what do we do next? I think where we should be ramping up an awful lot of it, and Azura is absolutely right, like we've got bits of legislation that kind of, they have lots of relevance in lots of places, like upskirting was obviously illegal, it's just we didn't have a bit of legislation that covered it, and we did in that case discover we needed a new piece of legislation. So either you need a CPS that is muscular enough to take some really punchy prosecutions, partly in pursuit of, do we need some new legislation? And for me, so much of this right now is stuck in a sort of what can we do, where are we? And we're losing sight of that there's a whole load of principles that we've lived with for the best part of centuries, and we could just try enforcing those at the start.
I'm going to wrap up there because we've gone slightly over time, but to say a huge thank you for being going, for tackling such a broad-ranging run at these issues. We fixed it, and for coming along into the kind of deep, dark basement of the Midland for what I think has been a really fascinating conversation, and one that continues in the work at Demos through the Epistemic Security network that we're running, and do get in touch about how you can get involved in that as well. But thank you very much to our panellists, and thank you to the audience.